Hey guys, welcome back to another YouTube video. My name's Nathan Chan. I'm the CEO and publisher of Foundr magazine. And in this video, we're going to be going through how to launch your podcast the right way and how to actually grow it. This is for beginners or even if you've just launched a podcast recently. So you might be wondering, who the hell is this guy? Why is he qualified to share what he's about to share with you on this video and actually teach you this stuff? Well, our podcast, the Foundr podcast, which we'll pull up on the screen actually, we've had millions of downloads for our podcast. I've been running it for the past 4 years and we've interviewed some of the greatest entrepreneurs of our generation. So I might know a thing or two on how to create a podcast and how to launch it with a bang. So the first thing that I want you to focus on or think about if you're just about to launch your podcast or just launched it is do not create a podcast unless you are prepared to produce at least 100 plus episodes and actually launch them. You might be able to produce them, but actually publish them, because I know shipping things might be scary if you're just getting started. But the reason that you need to produce and be prepared to produce at least 100 plus is because the podcast environment is so noisy. There are so many podcasts. Everyone has a podcast. Even 4 years ago when I started the Foundr podcast, there were so many podcasts. And I knew, and this is what somebody told me, that a really successful podcast, they said, Nathan, you have to be prepared to just do this for the long haul, because you actually won't get traction until you have at least 100 plus episodes. Because if you think about it, people will subscribe to that podcast, and make sure you subscribe to the Foundr podcast. I think you'll love it. People will subscribe to that podcast and they'll only follow future episodes, or they might go back to further episodes. And the more that people are listening to your episodes and the more you have a larger catalog, the more people you can actually attract. So this is very, very important, and consistency matters when it comes to growing an audience on any channel, whether it's Instagram, podcast, blog, whatever. You have to be consistent. For whatever reason, people, companies, businesses, content creators that are consistent on one particular channel, that have some sort of schedule, whether you post once every 2 weeks, once a month, once a week, once a day, 3 times a week, doesn't matter. You just have to stick to it. Think of it like working out at the gym. If you go to the gym every single week, once a week, and work on your biceps, you're doing bicep curls and you up the weight every single time, of course your biceps are going to get bigger. You've got to fuel yourself, of course, and you've got to have the right nutrition. You have to have the right form, but if you do that over time, it works. It's the exact same analogy. So that's the first thing. Do not launch a podcast unless you're prepared for the long haul, because it takes time. So the second thing that you want to be doing when it comes to launching your podcast is making sure that you differentiate yourself. Now, I know that might be hard. There might be a lot of interview shows out there right now, but you've got to find a way. Whether it's, you interview a certain type of fitness professional, you interview a certain person that speaks to a certain audience, whether you don't do an interview show, whether you do a fact-finding mystery or whatever it is, you have to make sure that you're differentiating yourself, because that's how you're going to stand out. That's how you're going to actually get cut through. Because like I said, there's a lot of podcasts. It's only growing, right? There's only going to be more podcasts, and a lot of podcasts struggle. Like, let's be honest. That's why I said in the last point, you have to be prepared to launch at least 100 plus episodes. I've read a statistic that most podcasts that launch, the average amount of downloads that they get is like, I think it's like a few thousand or 5,000 or something like that. Like the Foundr podcast, we get tens of thousands of downloads per episode. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm just saying it to put it into perspective, what's required to build a podcast, probably to the size that you want to build it. So make sure you work out a way to differentiate yourself. How did we do this for Foundr? The way that I did it was I noticed that there was a gap in the marketplace for interviewing startup founders that have actually done it, but perhaps startup founders that you may not have heard of. So one of our big things at Foundr, and the way that we've been able to differentiate ourselves is, yes, we interview the Seth Godins, the Gary V's, the Tim Ferrisses and Tony Robbins of the world, but we also interview founders of like very, very big companies where you might have heard of the company, but you might not know the founder. Like, for example, the founder of Indiegogo, the founder of ClassPass, the founder of Dropbox. These are incredible founders that you may not have heard of. And because we have a magazine, we've been able to get in touch with these people. But that was the biggest differentiating thing that I was able to really instill in the Foundr podcast. Another thing that we actually did to differentiate ourselves was you had a guy, myself, who'd never created a business before, asking these people questions that you probably want to know. So I was coming from an experience point of having no experience. So I was more of an investigative journalist of trying to find out how can I get these answers that majority of people listening want to know. So those were the two kind of things that I really focused on, was really strategic about when it comes to differentiating our podcast, the Foundr podcast. So the third thing that you need to make sure you do is really focus on your cover art. This is something that nobody talks about, but the way that your podcast is going to get found if you're not promoting it is tapping into a marketplace, i.e. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora, where people like, for the Foundr podcast, they go to business podcasts and they're just searching through a sea of cover art. They'll see the title of the podcast and they will see actually what the cover art looks like. So what you want to make sure you do is your cover art stands out, because that's the thing that's going to get people's attention. Because when people are looking and browsing for a podcast, the decisions they are making is, what does the cover art look like? Does it get my attention? Bang, I click on it. Okay, what are the episodes? What is the description? Does this look interesting? Is the person on the cover art, do I trust them? Do I like the look of that person? Now, I know you might be thinking, well, that sounds really judgmental, Nathan, but honestly, psychologically, people will form a bias just scientifically, like it's in our physiology, that you will look at that person and be like, okay, do I trust that person or not? Whether you like it or not. So you've got to think about that strategically. Like, do I put my face on the cover art? Do I not? Is this photo of me? Would this person trust me? You've got to think about these things. Maybe I don't put myself on the cover art. Maybe I want to launch a show where I have many people, different people doing the interviews, so it might be difficult. Like, that's what we'll probably do for the Foundr podcast in the end, because we want to scale up. So these are some of the things you have to think about, but the cover art is very, very important. It's like, think of going to a bookshelf. What is the book that's going to get your attention? Think of looking at all the movies on Netflix. When I look at the movies that I want to watch, I'm looking at the cover art. That's what I'm judging it on. It's like, subconsciously, I am judging that and I'm looking for something that's going to get my attention. So make sure you spend the extra money on a designer if you can, to make sure that cover art pops, and make sure you put it in the category. So let's just say you're launching a fitness podcast. Actually, when you're designing the podcast cover art, go to the fitness section, actually put a mock of it and look how it would look across all the different podcasts in your market that you're going to compete against, and actually make sure that it pops. Make sure the headline and the text that you use really, really stands out. It's going to get people's attention. So the fourth thing that you need to make sure you do is trend on the new and noteworthy when you launch. Now, what is the new and noteworthy? Well, the new and noteworthy is a section for every single category of a podcast where all the new podcasts are in there, and that usually lasts between 60 to 90 days. And what's really, really powerful is if you can trend on there, you can get a lot of first mover advantage in that particular category. I've read many articles and I've seen many people do it very, very well. So you have to make sure you get that first mover advantage and trend in that particular section, because if you do, you can ride that momentum. Like, I've seen people that get like hundreds of thousands of downloads or tens of thousands of downloads in the first couple of months of their podcast, because they've been trending, and that's how they've built up and got their initial early stage podcast audience. So how the hell do you do that? Well, what you have to make sure you do is you batch all your podcast episodes. So when you launch, they say that you should launch with at least 3. So I recommend launching with at least 3 podcast episodes to trend in the new and noteworthy. Another thing you want to make sure you do is make sure you've got a good consistent batch so you can put out, like after you launch with 3, make sure you launch with 1 a week or 1 every couple of days. But basically you want to get number 1 or trending really, really high in the new and noteworthy, because that's where you're going to get all your initial traction. This is so extremely important. So the 5th thing that you need to focus on when it comes to launching or growing or scaling your podcast is you need to get as many reviews as possible in as many different countries. Make sure it's diverse. Don't just focus on the US or just Australia or on the UK or Canada or on India or wherever, right? Reviews are a very, very strong signal for iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher or Pandora, any of these platforms, to see, okay, well, people are enjoying this podcast. So especially when you first launch, you want to get as many reviews as possible to make sure that you trend. This is very, very important. So you can do all sorts of things. You can say on the podcast, make sure you leave a review. I'm calling out the biggest reviews. You can do all sorts of things. I've seen people do giveaways. I've seen people do all sorts of things to really make sure they have a focus on getting reviews. So that's very, very important. The more reviews you get over time, and especially in a short amount of period, the higher your podcast will rank in the trending sections or in the actual category you're playing against, and the more likelihood you're going to get more subscribers, more downloads, and be able to build your audience. So the 6th and final point is, when it comes to growing your podcast, or if you're launching it, you want to get on as many shows as possible in your category, if possible. So what does that mean? Well, let's just say in the business category, we know that James Altucher has a podcast or Tim Ferriss has a podcast. I haven't been on either of those podcasts, but this is an example. If I wanted to build the Foundr podcast audience, those would be great shows to go on, because people are already interested in business or startups, et cetera, or personal development, personal growth, and they're the kind of people that we want to follow the Foundr brand and listen to the Foundr podcast. So if I got on that podcast or one of those podcasts, which has a massive audience of podcast listeners, then there's a high likelihood that a big proportion of those people that listen to my interview on one of those shows, they're going to go and follow Foundr and particularly the Foundr podcast. And the reason that is because there's a certain kind of person that listens to podcasts. You should look at your own kind of learning or how you like to consume content. There's kind of 3 different learning modalities that people like to consume content. There's audio, there's written, and there's video. So depending on who you are and how you like to consume content, that you want to find people that are pure audio, that people love listening to podcasts. Myself, that's how I do a lot of my learning, via podcast or actually watching videos. I don't read that much. So I'm always trying to listen and find new podcasts. And if I heard somebody on Tim Ferriss's podcast that also has a podcast, like for example, Naval, I heard him on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and then I went and listened to his podcast. It was awesome, right? So you want to be able to do that and get on as many shows as possible. It's very, very important. So those are my top 6 strategies when it comes to launching, growing, or scaling your podcast if you're a beginner or just recently launched. So if you are enjoying these videos, guys, please do make sure you subscribe. We interview some of the greatest entrepreneurs of our generation and get all sorts of legit founders to come on this channel and teach you how to do certain things. And the biggest thing is they have to have done it before. Like me, I'm teaching you guys about podcasts because we've built a decent sized podcast. So make sure you guys subscribe. We drop new videos every single week. If you enjoyed this video, please do like it. It helps us big time. And lastly, leave a comment below on what your biggest challenge is right now when it comes to launching your podcast. Our team, we respond to every single comment. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll speak to you soon.
The Foundr mission is to help you create an ass-kicking business and help you learn straight from the mouths of world-class founders. Get your free printed edition of Foundr magazine featuring Sir Richard Branson. Just cover shipping and handling at foundr.com/Branson.